We have George DeBarge, our town planner, and Al Currington from the planning board here. And the purpose of tonight is to have a public hearing opportunity about 4 proposed changes to the land use ordinance. We will take them kind of one at a time, starting with the resource protection, and kind of open the floor for comments and questions. We don't have a podium microphone arrangement here like we typically have like at town meeting. So people will raise their hands. I'll call on people, I'll try to keep track of what order they went up, but I won't make any promises. And then most questions I would assume are gonna be answered by George or Al, because it's really the planning board and the planner that have done the work on these ordinances. The select board, we vote to put them on the ballot for people to vote on. But unlike budget articles where you get a selectman recommend something and budget committee recommends something, there's no recommendation attached to these from the select board. It's just putting out there for a public vote. All right, so I'll turn it over to George, and I think the first, I don't know if you have any introductory comments or whatever, but we'll start with the resource protection zone proposed changes. You want to briefly summarize really what the changes are, and then we can open it for discussion.
Yeah, I thought what might be helpful is just to give a little bit of perspective on how this came about. I started working for the town back in 2018 when the select board and planning board wanted to do an update of the comprehensive plan. That last was done in 2002, back when the town was experiencing, like most of southern Maine, a lot of development and a building boom. So like so many towns, Durham looked for the ability to put in a limit on the number of new housing starts. And in order to do that, you had to have a comprehensive plan that met state requirements. And basically it put a limit of 45 new housing starts per year. To my knowledge, only 1 year that was ever hit, and that was the first year that it was put in place because it caused a run on the permits. But after that, it averaged well less than 45. This last decade, only about 15 new homes have been built in this town for about 10 years now.
Per year.
Excuse me. Yes, more than that. So at the time of the review of the comprehensive plan, we looked at it and said, look, Durham is not Scarborough, and really the plan is not workable according to the state guidelines. So we did an update to the comprehensive plan, and kind of the 3 overarching principles that came out of that, goals of the community, were number 1, to preserve the rural character of this community. And then secondly, to preserve agriculture. And then thirdly, to balance property rights with the public interest. So those are kind of the overarching goals, and then looked at a number of policies in there. So the new plan that was adopted in 2018 says basically keep the whole town rural. And that's mainly done through the zoning that requires a minimum lot size of 2 acres and 300 feet of road frontage for each individual lot. And the idea is to spread out and not have densely developed subdivisions like some other towns. So there was an addendum that was put into the comprehensive plan, and as we're seeing right now with the housing crunch, there could be a lot of more development pressure on this community in the future. So the comprehensive plan includes an addendum that says if and when more than 45 housing units are built in 1 year, or the planning board approves more than 100 subdivision lots, then there'll be call for a special town meeting, consideration of a moratorium, and possibly consider whether or not the town should have a growth management plan so that it could put in a growth cap. And none of that goes into play until those thresholds are exceeded. So the current, as I said, the current plan is really looking to keep the town rural. The 2 main mechanisms to do that are the resource protection zoning, in addition to the rural zoning, and then the other piece of it is the allowance within subdivisions to cluster and create 1 acre lots with dedicated open space. And part of the idea of that is to preserve the natural resource areas and sensitive areas. That's kind of the background of how we get here, and this is part of implementing that new plan. So I just wanted to show you basically what happened and why this is important to change the resource protection zone. Oh, you sure can.
Thank you, I saw the pictures.
So this is the zone map that was done as a result of the 2002 comprehensive plan. And so basically, everything that's in this kind of brown color and this green, that's all resource protection. And this is a lot more than most towns have. And part of the reason that there is so much resource protection is that in 2002, they were using mapping mainly about floodplains. Obviously, the Androscoggin River, a lot of the streams that come in, the low areas around Runaround Pond, in the major flood events, those areas are saturated and sometimes overflow. So they based it on mapping from the 1970s, 1980s, and this plan actually was done in 2002 based on that old mapping. Just to give you an idea how outdated the information was. One of the criteria for resource protection says Androscoggin River floodplain area as defined by the Army Corps of Engineers, 1936 flood record. So what has happened in 2018, we received a lot of updated information. The state over the last 20 years has really developed a lot of good topographical information, much more accurate flood mapping. So we set out in the comprehensive plan calls for the town to update the zoning map, particularly with respect to the resource protection, because that's the part that has the most impact on individual properties, to reflect that latest data and make sure that any restrictions that are put on property are based on accurate scientific information and not old outdated maps. So as a result, I did an analysis using some mapping tools that I have and some data that was provided by the Greater Portland Council of Governments. And this is the current zoning map, which shows it a little bit more clearly in terms of the resource protection district. As you can see, Runaround Pond area. This is, I think, Alden Brook coming in here, that whole area where the outflow from Runaround Pond goes down. And then Chandler Brook, the Dyer Brook coming down through here. There's a headwater wetlands up in here. These streams that go down to the river, as well as the area around, I think that's Swamp Road there. So that whole area drains down that way as well. So all of that was based on old mapping, and the comprehensive plan that was done in 2018 provides a lot more accurate. And the basic change that's proposed is based on that new, more accurate data. Basically, all of the areas in dark green would meet at least one of 6 criteria. Some of them meet more. First one would be the 100-year floodplain based on the FEMA maps. So that's a policy that's been in effect since 2002. 2004 is actually when we adopted it. State shoreland zoning, except for there were some farm fields with wetlands that had to be added to meet state DEP requirements. And so those are not going to be part of the resource protection. But all other shoreland zone around the streams within 100 feet, the Androscoggin River, which includes the floodplain. This is where I think the DOT pile was, right about there. Land forested and emergent wetlands. The criterion from 2002 was swamps. This one, swamps shown on the tax maps, which is not a very accurate depiction of where wetlands are in this community. And then the fifth one, excuse me, this is in shoreland zoning. There is a criterion that within 250 feet of waterfowl and wading bird habitats that have been rated by Inland Fisheries and Wildlife as moderate or high value, those would also stay in. And only one new criterion for resource protection is mentioned in the comprehensive plan, and that is areas where you have an overlap of a lot of these different issues. Wetlands, floodplain, wildlife habitat, those areas, and there's kind of a rating system that, beginning with habitat, Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Program has developed, and that's all in the comprehensive plan. So, the plan is to update this in 2 phases. And I talked to the select board, and back in October, they approved this 2-phase approach. First phase says, look, all of this area within the light gray and the dark gray is currently resource protection, which virtually allows no development, very limited development. So, but it's not based on accurate data. And so the first step in the process is to fix what's wrong. And so I proposed, and the select board agreed with the strategy of basically anything that doesn't meet one of these criteria, such as all of this area in gray, doesn't meet any of these resource protection criteria, that would be removed from resource protection and just put into rural agricultural zone that affects the rest of the town. There are some areas, however, that do meet these 6 criteria, and those are outside that existing resource protection. And once we fix what is broken, then next year, working with the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission, I've proposed a 2nd phase that would apply the same criteria to the land that meets them outside the existing resource protection. That would have to be added. Now, we did send out, and the select board directed the town manager and myself to send out a letter to every property owner who has their land either going in or coming out. And so we did phase 1 this year. Probably many of you here, if not most of you here, are here because you got a letter. And I've had several people call. I have developed a GIS system for the town, which allows you to look right on an air photo and see where the existing is and where the proposed is. So after this meeting, if you want to get in touch with me, I'd be more than happy to send you very detailed pictures and maps of what your property, again, it's not survey accuracy, but it's probably a lot better than the little map you got in the mail, which is probably why some of you are here tonight. This is the letter that explained it, and this is the map that went out to everybody. So that basically is the plan, and again, no property will be added to resource protection in this round. Next round, any of you that have resource protection and it's retained, the town will consider at town meeting next year if we go forward. And we'll have a lot more time to explore, give more time for people to look at those hard decisions that will be made next year.
Yeah, because those will be, that's obviously, it's a much bigger conversation when you're talking about putting property into resource protection versus taking it out from a property owner's perspective. So like George said, we're not proposing to put anything new into resource protection this year. We're only proposing to take stuff out that doesn't meet the criteria that was established in the comprehensive plan for being in resource protection. And then even next year, people will have the opportunity to challenge if your property is proposed to go into resource protection. There will be mechanisms that you can use to dispute that or argue against it. It's not like a done deal. So that's why we split it into 2 phases, because that's going to require a lot more groundwork and conversation, if you will. All right. So at this point, said I'll do my best to direct traffic as people have questions or comments. It doesn't have to be a question. So if you raise your hand and we'll gentleman in the back.
Just a question on section 2.3B B2A, sorry. It says 100-year floodplains as determined by the most recent FEMA flood mapping study. Does that mean if it changes, if the FEMA map changes at any given time, the town automatically accepts it at that point, or would the town need to approve the acceptance of the new map?
Okay, on every one of these, you'll notice the language "and shown on the zoning map."
That one doesn't say that.
It should, and that will be added. Every one of these should say "as shown on the." You notice all the others do?
I do, that's why I asked that one.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. And so basically, the answer to that specific question is that before anything can be added to the resource protection, it has to go through a town meeting vote, including these changes to pull stuff out. So just be aware, even though, and that's why we put that language in there, as shown on the zoning map, to clarify that when something is determined, that doesn't put it on, it has to still go through a mapping process and a town meeting process to approve that change to the zoning map. This is actually, that's the language that's gonna be added. This map will be modified, the current zoning map, based on this map.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Heather?
I had a couple of questions. George, can you explain where you said some farm fields are not on there, but they had to be on there for DEP? Is that
I can
what
actually
they're?
show you those.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So this is the current zoning map. And, you know, in addition to the town's, growth cap and comprehensive plan not meeting, the town had shoreline zoning imposed by the DEP back in 1994 because it didn't meet the state criteria, and so the state basically imposed that zoning on the town for shoreline zoning. It was a separate shoreline zoning map that was imposed. So in order to get the plan approved and the ordinance approved, the DEP, we had to add, because technically these are in law. This is off Bowie Hill Road. There's a couple here over on the border with Auburn. And then there's one here, and then another one. So there are five, or there's six large, and these are what they call emergent wetlands. So the farm field, if you look at an air photo, you can see the trenches where they drain that wetland to create the field. It's a great place for crops because you have water year-round. But technically, under the EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, those are wetland and they're regulated by the Clean Water Act. So under shoreline zoning, and it just makes no sense whatsoever, but you have to have a shoreline zoning district around the parts of the farm fields that are wetland. Now, I did include in the report, if you want to get the report, put it on the website, basically an analysis of this and a suggestion that the town might want to challenge that, because, like I said, it's very hard to support that these farm fields need the same kind of shoreline zoning protection as the English Garden River or around pond. But under the Maine DEP guidelines and requirements, that's what should get. So these were added, but this is limited residential, which does allow development with some restrictions on buffers and stuff like that. A couple of parts of this, tiny portions, and some of this one over here, which is all in resource protection anyway, has to have resource protection. But those are not part of this analysis.
Okay, so let's say that this is adopted,
Yeah,
do they stay or do they go away?
they stay until it gets changed. And I
This
did
change?
discuss, this is, the only parts of this map that are gonna change are the ones that are shown on this map, and those farm fields are not shown. Because that's a separate issue, you have to challenge the state, which I think the goal here is to fix the broken parts and then move on to other issues.
So that's more of a phase two issue.
Could be a phase three, depending on how much you wanna go after that.
But it's not part of the vote at this time.
Yeah.
Is there a diagram that shows what is coming, not what's coming out, what's going in?
That's in phase two.
Okay, so there's no
Not
visual
on
of
the
that
table.
at this point.
It is in the report that I provided to the select board, and we'll make available to anybody here that wants it.
Okay, and one last thing, although I might come.
That's what we're here for.
The definition of a perennial stream, where can we find that?
It is in state law as well as in the definitions in this ordinance. And basically, a perennial stream is one that has water most of the year. And it's a very technical definition, and there are different rules if it's a perennial stream or what they call an intermittent stream that doesn't usually have water all year round. And they have different setbacks and buffering requirements, so basically, it has to have like a mineral bottom where it's scoured by the running water most of the time. It can be dry in the summer, in August, but it's still a perennial stream.
And would it be the responsibility of the landowner if this map, because this isn't on the ground mapping, correct? This is done by
That's
the
correct.
software.
That's
So
right.
if this were adopted, would it then be on the landowner to prove that one of those things wasn't in existence on their land?
Yes, and there is a process you can go through. As a matter of fact, the equestrian center down on Royalsboro Road, I can't remember the name of it, but they came in and their barn and paddocks and everything were in the resource protection from the old mapping. And, they went to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Were you part of that?
I was.
Yeah, you remember?
I
So
do.
basically, they brought in, detailed information that showed, and I showed, that these maps were not accurate. And therefore, the Board of Appeals gave them relief and removed the resource protection from that part, which wasn't on this map. But to have to go through that every time is not really good. So this idea is to fix that, not just for those people, but to fix it for the majority of the people that are affected in one spell swoop.
Thank you.
That little gray area that you're pointing to, you said that there were 3 areas, no, on that map that.
Oh, on this one?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the ones that were added in, you said they had to be added in because of something from
State law requires it.
1996.
Yeah,
Those were only added in like 2 years ago,
that's correct.
so,
Which is when the town tried to get the DEP to approve this zoning and get rid of the state imposed one.
at that time, I thought we were told that it was from 2002 or 2006. But anyway, at that point, that happens to be my property right there, and I'm a little irritated. I was also told that at that time, and this was kind of, the planning board said one thing, I went home and I came back, and it was changed when I went back. And basically, like Heather said, the onus now is on the landowner via, I believe it's called the delineation zoning map that needs to get done. Is that correct?
Not exactly, it's the same idea, but what you're talking about, if you were to apply for development permits, say a subdivision with the planning board, or a single home with the code officer, basically, you gotta do what they call a wetland delineation, which is hiring a wetland specialist. Typically, most soil evaluators that do septic systems do this, and they have to go out and determine based on the type of soil it is, how much water there is, and the types of plants that are there, whether it's technically a wetland. So that boundary in your field, you know, till you do that type of analysis, you can't tell exactly where that boundary is.
Right,
And
but
so
that
then
onus
going out
is on
from
me.
that 250 feet is gonna vary, but that can't be done without on-the-ground delineation.
Right, which costs the homeowner more money.
But again,
That
that's
wasn't
state
there.
law, it's state and federal law.
Yeah, but you guys said last time that we have to add it in, and tonight you're telling me that it's been there since 1996, and that
No,
is two different.
No, that's not what I said. I said the state imposed DEP shoreland zoning back in 1994. There have been a lot of changes since then, and I think this was probably added later. But the shoreland zoning imposition did occur back in 1994. So whether the town adopts it or not, the state is gonna apply this. And if you were to go out there and violate it, you'd be in violation of state law. And again, if you look at the report, and I'd be happy to provide you with that part of it, that looks specifically at your situation and says, look, there is some way to deal with this. Not requiring you to go out and hire soil evaluators to do it, because that wouldn't do any good. The law is still the law.
But the law in our area was not in effect until we put it on the map.
No, it's not accurate. The reason we put it on the map is because it wasn't effective law.
But if the planning board agreed with what I was planning to do at that time, I would have gotten away with whatever, I'm assuming, I don't wanna say got it away, because I paid good money for my land and I thought it was all usable, and now I'm being told that a chunk of it is in wetlands. So I have to say, I'm not a happy camper. Nobody wants to hear that. And I think how those got in was it was 3 little spots. That was the only ordinance that did pass, correct? Last time when there were things on the board, they all got voted down except for this one, and I think.
No, this was 2 years ago, everything passed unanimously. Last year, some of these other issues did not pass.
Okay.
But we'll get into that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, I own a home on Ball Factory Lane in Meadowbrook Estates. I purchased it new back in 1999. And when I went to refinance in 2003, I discovered it was in a flood zone. I had no idea it was. Therefore, the owners got the office, so we need to pay for flood insurance. And talking to lawyers at Pearson Outland, working with, Technical Services Cooperated, engineering firm in Albany. They surveyed from the 100-year floodplain at the end of Scotty River, they started the flood of 1987.
Yep.
All the way back to the basement of my house. And I had to get statements from town people, plus the information that entered during the survey. And the survey company had sent all the information to FEMA.
Yeah.
And FEMA supplied a, what's it called?
Map amendment.
Map amendment.
Yeah.
Right. My question is, does this change that, or am I still out of a flood zone?
And basically what they did was they revised the flood map to be more accurate based on the survey, the flood elevation certificate. Where a surveyor comes out and shows that your basement is at least 1 foot above the flood level.
Yeah.
And that, but you have to do that, just like sometimes you have to document that on flood laws. So that's part of the
So I
process.
should,
This doesn't affect that.
Good.
So if other pieces of property end up getting put into these areas of, what did you call it?
Resource protection.
Resource protection, will our taxes be affected in that, I shouldn't be paying top dollar for land that I can't use?
Talk to the assessor. I don't do assessing. Get into enough trouble.
Yeah,
Selectmen,
you
is
could,
that
but,
something?
yeah, no, but George is essentially right, so anytime for whatever reason, that you feel like your property is not assessed properly for some reason, then you go to the assessor and you say, that, I think I'm assessed too high for these reasons, and then the assessor, does the research and makes a determination, yes, you're right, or no, we don't think that, we think we are assessed properly. So I'll bet we do 6 to 12, abatements a year from people that have gone to the assessor and made the case that their taxes should be lower, and the assessor says, yeah, you're right, and the taxes have been lowered, so it does happen. Any other, yes, sir, in the back?
Yeah, I have a question on the page here, proposed land ordinance. It says, the only locations that are required to be resource protection are floodplains and steep slopes within 250 feet of the underside of the river, and a little bit more there. So where did the emergent wetlands and the wading bird, and I like birds, mind you.
I understand.
Name's birds here. But where did that come in? Cause what I'm wondering is, are there minimum resource protection requirements that we need to meet? And are these in excess of those requirements?
The answer is yes and yes. There are, under state law, the floodplains and steep slopes along the Androscoggin River. It's over 20% slope. So this area is floodplain, these areas here are steep slopes. Within 250 feet of the river, if it meets either of those criteria by state law, it must be in resource protection. Okay? But under state law, a town can go beyond the minimum state requirements based on a comprehensive plan that goes through a public process. So, and in order to have restrictions that go beyond the state requirements, the town basically should have good data, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, whether to put it in resource protection or not, that's a policy decision that has to be decided by the voters. And again, this stuff has been in resource protection since 2002, right or wrong. And to take it out, it has to go to a public meeting vote. To add anything new in, it has to go to a town meeting vote, but the town has the authority to do that under state law. So we tried to distinguish, and I presented to the select board, the analysis that was done. Alan and the planning board hired Michael Morse, who used to be the DEP coordinator for the state, to look at, under state law, what of this must be resource protection under state law. and not a lot of that, other than, some areas around Runaround Pond and the Androscoggin River. Has to be under some form of shoreline zoning, but it doesn't necessarily have to be resource protection. So yes, the town has been since 2002 going beyond the minimum state requirements.
Can that be wound back? If the
Absolutely
town
can.
decides?
Absolutely
Because
can.
most of it is private
Now,
property.
just so you know, the town did a process with the update to the comprehensive plan where it presented to the people that participated and ultimately to the voters, different scenarios. One went in the other direction, put more into the resource protection. One said, roll it all back, we called it the Walmart rollback program. Roll it all back to the minimum state requirements on everything. And, you know, like 15% of the participants, and we did a survey.
Yeah, we did, as part of the comprehensive plan process, there's a lot of public, input in, so there were several public hearings and workshops, and I think George mentioned at the beginning, like kind of the three, main guiding principles that kind of came out of that. One of them was balancing private property rights with resource protection, and that was really the message that came out. It was pretty evenly split among people that wanted to put more into resource protection versus people that wanted to go the other way and take, some out of resource protection. So what went into the comprehensive plan was a list of criteria, based upon the actual habitat data we had, and that's where the town landed during the comprehensive plan process on what would be the criteria to determine what would go into resource protection. And so what we're doing now is following up on that and saying, okay, based on those criteria that the town identified, in this year, we're proposing taking certain properties out of resource protection because it doesn't meet the criteria that was established in the comprehensive plan. Next year, part two is, here are properties that do meet the criteria, but are not currently in resource protection. So the conversation becomes what properties that are not currently in go into resource protection. But that's next year's conversation. This year is just about what comes out of resource protection.
George, were you part of the comprehensive plan process? You are, sorry that I didn't know. Who, was it the facilitator, or was it you, or was it the select board that drove the prompts for the choices?
It was a combination of the planning board and the select board had members of the committee.
It was the comprehensive planning committee, it wasn't the select board. The select board
I'm
really
sorry.
didn't really have a
Absolutely
role
right.
in drafting the comprehensive plan, that was up to the
Yeah,
committee.
so it was the comprehensive plan committee that consisted of planning board and select board members as well as some other citizens. And, they hired a facilitator from the Greater Portland Council of Governments.
Yeah.
And so it was a combination of, that group, everything that was put out was run by the group, they approved it, both the survey that was done online as well. And part of this is how do you break this very complicated stuff down to either a discussion like this or a survey is even worse to try to communicate this stuff. But I think the message got through and people didn't come in and say, I don't understand any of this, I understand it, I don't like it, but I do understand it. So that was all part of the comprehensive plan process, that is why we're here tonight.
So if we got a letter in the mail saying that we're impacted, does
Yeah.
that mean some of the property that we own is being taken out of the protection? And what does that actually mean? I can build a shed now, or,
Well,
what does it mean?
I'll show you probably the biggest impacts. I was talking about the equestrian center. Okay, so they're right here, this is off Royalsboro Road, just before the bend there. So almost their entire property, or at least more than half of it, was in resource protection. They wanted to do a day camp for the equestrian center, and when we went to the code officer, it's not permitted use, he said you can't do it. So we had to go to the Board of Appeals and show them basically how this is the old bad data, this is the current data, more accurate, and what they wanted to do wasn't even in the resource protection. So that'll be the effect, wherever you see the light gray, what you couldn't do before, you will be able to do now.
Yes, sir.
So you're talking about on Swamp Road, I own a huge chunk of Swamp Road, and, we're a family subdivision, not subdivision, but
I understand.
we're giving it to the family.
Yep.
I have a lot next to Meadowbrook, and, it looks like it's going to be in resource protection.
If it isn't in resource protection now, it won't be. If it is, it'll stay unless it's not in the floodplain or within 100 feet of the brook.
Alright, so we've got, code enforcement officer, the old one, said it was a buildable lot.
Yep.
We've got a, septic design, we have not got a building permit yet, so am I gonna be grandfathered if this goes in resource
Yes.
protection?
Okay, so number one, if you do it in the next year, you should be good to go, because if it's not in there, I mean, if it's not, doesn't meet the criteria, it'll be pulled out, so there wouldn't be any restriction.
Okay.
And then if it's gonna be even considered to be put in, that won't happen at least until April of 2023. So you got a whole year that you don't even have to worry about it.
Okay, so my land runs down Meadowbrook, Meadowbrook cuts through my land,
Okay.
and I've got 3 kids to give land to.
Yep.
And it's all close to the brook.
Okay.
All buildable land,
Yep.
if they don't do it within the next year.
They can't build unless they build closer than 100 feet to the brook.
Okay, so it's 100 feet.
Yeah.
100 feet, we're good. I was told
Unless it extends out a little bit more, you can look at it and pretty much tell, you know.
Oh, we're 100 feet, that's not an issue.
Right, but the wetlands and the floodplain may go a little bit farther, so, but you can generally tell by the topography, you know, you can see where the floodplain is.
Alright, well, on the edge of the brook, of course, it's high, and, you know, it builds up,
Yeah.
so it's all
Yeah.
higher land,
So
so.
you should be good.
Should be good.
Yep.
Okay. That's kinda gray right there.
But George, you'd be willing to talk to him if he came in and showed you his land and?
My pen just ran out of ink.
Don't worry,
You know.
Jared, I gotcha.
Well, we bought all this land for our kids, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
They need to build on it.
Yeah.
They live in Durham now, and
Yep.
they, you know, get them out of the house, get them their own house. And I wanna make sure we can still do that in this town.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the back had his hand up, and then I'll come here.
Yeah, George, just, in regards to his question and your comment that it should be good to go. I own the yellow house at the end of Swamp Road, and, that's about 30 feet above the stream. But when I bought that house, I had to get flood insurance. So somebody didn't look at that. You might look at it and say it's never gonna be wet, but the last time that yellow house was wet, the last time that property was wet was when Noah was in the yard. But there it is, and it's
I
still
saw
on the
that.
map. Yeah, you might remember.
My relatives own that house.
So, I mean, it's just an observation, you know, that we can't always tell, you know, I may think this land is great.
Yeah.
But their maps in Washington are different than our good samples.
And just understand, this information is not perfect, but it's a lot better than what it was based on in 2002, which was not very good at all. And we're trying to get more accurate, to be fairer and be more accurate on the regulations.
This gentleman here.
Now, that 100 feet back from the stream, does that apply to the Androscoggin as well, or is the Androscoggin different?
Well, the Androscoggin zone of restriction or limitations within 250 feet of the normal high water mark. So the streams are only 100 feet on either side, so that's the difference. But there is a 100-foot setback, but it's all resource protection, so you're not gonna be building within 250 feet of the river anyway, because it's either floodplain or steep slopes.
So I'm confused between 100 feet and 250 feet, because I thought I had to be 250 feet away.
Okay, so you need to look at the difference between a stream
Yeah,
and a large wetland area like that, or runaround pond, or the river. Streams, apart from floodplains, are only 100 feet on either side of the brook.
okay.
Runaround pond, the Androscoggin River, and these large open wetlands, it's 250 feet. From there is shoreland zoning, and generally there's a 100-foot setback within that. So
We just
there-
went from 250 to 100, so please.
within the 250, the first 75 feet and 100 feet are buffering and setback requirements. Does that make sense?
No, I'm still missing the boat.
Okay, so if you're right, if you're either along the river or run around pond,
No, I'm in the gray, go in the.
yes, I understand, I'm just trying to explain, unfortunately, the same rules that apply to run around pond apply to the wetlands of your farm. Those same rules don't apply to along a stream. You don't have to be 250 feet from a stream. It gets regulated, only the 100 feet.
So what you're telling me is around that glazed circle, I have to be 250 feet out on any side of that.
You have to get a shoreland zoning permit within that orange, and you have to maintain a 70, which doesn't make any sense, I understand. I know, I understand, it doesn't make any sense, and Mike Morse, the former DEP, regulator, said that doesn't make any sense. So again, let's look at the report together, and I'll show you what's in there, and then that might at least give you a glimmer of hope.
And as George mentioned, you know, that's an example of something that is so nonsensical that it may be able to be challenged legally. And if that were the case, the town would discuss doing that, you know, for all those areas that are in a similar situation.
Right.
I wish you could see my facial expression. Maybe it's better you can.
Hold on, gentleman up front here?
I happen to own a farm field, a hay field, okay, and I think I might have some things, I'm right next to Jane's place there, and you said farm fields are different than streams and all that, okay? I remember when those ditches were put in, I was just a kid, my father and uncles and whatnot put those ditches in, and the only reason for it was the big hunkin' hill right next to that field and all that.
Bring down to it?
Runs down through it, runs right across it, and it's out.
Yeah.
And that's it, right now, it's gone. You know, normally after almost a record rain, within 24 hours it's dry again. But, you know, if it's gonna affect any valuation on a property, which, you know, I imagine it might, I'm gonna have to go and get some kind of adjustment on my tax situation, because, if this thing's gonna eat up all my land and whatnot like that, and I'm allowed just a little spot, because, you know, I was gonna put a lean-to over and back to put some equipment underneath and all that kind of thing out of the way, you know, different seasons, but I don't know. We'll see what we can do, but I'll tell you what, you come up in July, and you'll find out there's 18-wheelers sitting out in that field picking up hay. Big, heavy, you know, 20-ton tractors running all over it and everything, they don't give a tire. I run my tractor, you know, so you could say it's wet, but it's not that wet. And, I don't know why I have a feeling somebody's looking just to make a point here. You know, the state's never come in and said anything to me, never said anything to the people that owned it ahead of me. This land's been farmed for probably 200 years, maybe a little bit longer. And so, you know, I don't know what to tell you, but, you know, I don't like any encroachment on the property that I've worked hard for. And, I feel it might be an overstep, that's all I'm thinking. So, we'll see where it goes, but I don't know, I just don't think all this hubbub is necessary. I think everybody's common sense would be better. That's it. You can run heavy equipment on something, how do you leave it back? I don't care. You can drive around on it all so long. Drive around on it right now. But,
that is the question that I had about valuation. If these changes go forward, will or could this affect another valuation when we have that done again?
Yeah, I think similar question came up before. If you feel that a change in your property in its relation to resource protection has impacted its value, then you would wanna, you know, work with the assessor and make your case and say, you know, I think my taxes are too high because my land is now, you know, less valuable because of X, Y, and Z, and the assessor would be the determining factor there.
So would the assessor have this information if these
Oh, yes.
changes go forward?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
So, just a question, so the fields that we're talking about and some of the other designated wetlands, that wasn't decided by the town, or you didn't decide those places, that came down from the state? So somebody in the state made the decision that
Well,
had
the
to be.
state adopts laws and regulations that are administered through the DEP. So if you're gonna do shoreline zoning, you have to do shoreline zoning by state law. Whatever you do has to be reviewed by the DEP staff. And when we ran this by the DEP staff, they said that's gotta be in there. In
So
order to
some-
get state approval of your shoreline zoning.
So somebody in the DEP decided those hayfields needed to be.
They meet the
shown.
criteria for
Okay,
federal
so-
wetland protection.
Yeah, it wasn't a local
It wasn't
decision.
a local decision.
No, we're-
Came
the-
from above.
Well, we
The
get
map
to,
is
we get to
reflecting
give
what the
people
law
bad
is.
news.
But I mean, the town had to adopt it, but it wasn't a decision by planning board, selectmen, or you that those things
Well, the
happened,
decision
right?
was to try to get the state to approve it, so in a way, yeah.
So, I mean, it doesn't, I don't believe it would affect our property, but just, would the fight for the landowner that has that issue go through the town, or would it go directly to the state?
Well, that's an issue, and the plan that I wrote, the report, the research that I did suggested that the town and the landowners cooperate on it. And you're likely to get much more hearing with the DEP if the town and the landowners are coming in and filing an appeal. So,
I think at a minimum, we would at least have a conversation with the town legal counsel on, you know, and with George consulting on the feasibility of that and likelihood of success, and do we have a case?
yeah, there's a three-part strategy. First is go to DEP staff and try to convince them. Shouldn't be there. Chances of that are pretty slim. Then you can appeal their decision to the Board of Environmental Protection, which is kind of like the state planning board for shoreline zoning. And so they have the authority to give that. But recognizing it impacts the whole state, all the farms in the state are subject to this, they're likely to be hesitant to do that, even if they think it makes sense. And what they're gonna likely say is it's in the law. Then, after you go through that process, you can talk to your legislators and say that law needs to change. So that's a strategy that, you know, whether it will work or not, I don't know, but it's probably worth a try. Because it just doesn't make sense to treat those farm fields like Turnaround Farm.
I have one more question.
Yep. Oh, yes, sir. Yep.
What happens if we don't meet the state criteria? What do? They put the selectmen in jail, or what do they do?
Well, if you are a developer and you're planning to put money into a development and the town says you can do it, there might be neighbors that say we don't think this is a good idea, and they will use anything and everything to make their case that the planning board can't approve it. So, us just saying, you know, it's okay, that doesn't get you off.
And the town can't knowingly issue a permit that it knows violates a state law.
No, that's not what I was asking. What happens if the town says, we're not gonna meet the state requirements for resource protection? What happens?
That's what they did in 1994, and the state came in and put it on the town.
What's the penalty? What do they do to it?
There are penalties,
I mean-
there's certain penalties against municipalities.
So the town would have to pay a fine or
I'd have to
something?
go look at
They
the,
could slap you on the back of the head, saying, oh, you bad.
You know, they keep finding you.
That's a
so you
strategy.
practice.
I wouldn't recommend that, but that is a strategy. That's what they did in 1994, and it didn't work.
Are we,
Sorry, I had it over here, and then I'll come back to you.
so I know where Jane lives, and I'm looking at that big gray circle, and I'm wondering the Bowie Hill subdivision that's in process right now.
That is right there. And, this one, so it doesn't, it's not affected by resource protection.
Is that it, House? Yep, down the way.
we're keeping the 100-foot setbacks for resource protection, that's staying in place.
Got it.
And I had one more thing, is if, like Darren's piece, if he puts a house there this year, and then it gets put into it, and
It
say.
would be grandfathered.
Okay,
Yep.
and he says, okay, I wanna put a garage on now, then what would happen?
It depends, it may be affected, because basically what's on the ground you can't change, but putting more on the ground might be affected.
So is there a process that they will be put in place, so say, additional, you know, buildings will be put on, they have to go through this process, or you have to go to the state?
Again, once it goes into effect, there's not a lot of leeway.
Yep, right.
George, Alan, Todd, and Kevin, I just want to thank everybody for your work in pushing this forward. I understand this is phase one, and I understand that it's not going to change anything that currently exists. But looking forward to phase two, and you talked about maybe some tax incentives. But if I realize that more of my property is going to be in a protection zone, who can I reach out to for maybe other incentives to make my property in a conservation district?
Well, many communities, I worked for Falmouth for 25 years, and they had a very ambitious land acquisition program. And they went out and bought conservation easements on a lot of properties. That's another tool that you can use. You can use zoning, and you can also use land acquisition programs, but obviously that's an expensive proposition. We did some farms in Falmouth that continued as farms, and we went to the Land for Maine Futures Board and got grants from the state to cover, and then the Trust for Public Land, so it was a public-private partnership. So a lot of communities have been very successful, not using the regulatory tool exclusively, but also using the kind of incentives that you talked about. It's an option.
But who's the organization in our area?
Trust for Public Land is across the nation. Land for Maine's Future Board is Maine, so they were talking about putting more money into the program.
Yeah, and there are other organizations too that do similar type of stuff, like Royal River Conservation Trust does some work like that, and there's not like a one-stop shop.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of organizations that do that type of thing.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I just had an administrative comment on the added language. Georgia, on E, so 2.3 B, after the semicolon, there's the word and, which I think, because it's a list of separate items, you may not want there.
Well, the and means that F is the final one of the list.
Okay.
And it's the same as the rest. So there's a semicolon after every one of them.
Yeah.
And then the final one has the and. It doesn't need to be there. It's just a convention they use.
Okay.
Doesn't change anything. If it said or, that would be different.
Yes,
So there's a vote at the next town
Yeah,
meeting
so town-
on this topic?
Yeah, town meeting, well, yeah, on some of this topic that we've been discussing, so I wanted to re-clarify that, so yes, April 2nd, 9 o'clock at the school. It's always, town meeting's always the first Saturday of the month, you know, when we're not in a pandemic, of April, when we're not in a pandemic. And so one of the questions is what we're talking about today, but again, we're only voting on phase one, which is taking properties out of resource protection. We are not adding the areas that has been the focus of a lot of the discussion to the map this year, correct?
Correct.
Right, that would be potentially next year.
So
Sorry, go ahead, yep.
when would that map come out? The
Which-
phase two map?
Oh, the phase two map?
The phase two map is available now, but we don't want to get it out because we don't want
Okay,
people to
alright.
think about it. Because that's not what we're voting.
Yeah, I think that horse left the barn a while ago.
Based on what happened last year with the ordinances, if this fails, then what?
Stays the same, it's all still resource protection.
Can you explain, or just articulate why that would be bad for the town? Even in terms of you and the planning board? I just feel like there's been a lot of time and a lot of money spent doing this to try to get us in line with the comprehensive plan. And whether I agree or not, I just would love to see, you know, these things, these efforts happen, so that we don't keep putting stuff out to vote and then having it fail. Which I appreciate this because I think this is an opportunity for people to learn what's going on, so thank you all for coming here to get informed before you go vote. And thank you for, you know, explaining what these things are. But if you could articulate, you know, why it's important for us to pass this stuff.
Well, that's a voter decision. Some people may think this is not a good idea because it's removing resource protection. Some people on the Conservation Commission have made that clear. They're not necessarily on board with this. So there's people in the community that have both perspectives, and that's why you have a town meeting.
If we don't go through with phase one, will phase two still come, you know, in?
Not likely.
Yeah, I agree, not likely, but I think if this failed, then we would probably want to try to ascertain why. Like, what was it, was there one aspect of it that people were, you know, really opposed to, or was it just the idea of any change at all? Like, I think we would try to dig into why, and depending upon what we got for information there, that would kind of drive what next steps might be.
So there is a possibility of phase one being approved, phase two not being approved? I mean, you're only approving phase one, so if the town votes to approve phase one, they could come in and say, we don't approve of adding any resource protection above and beyond that.
That's right, that could happen. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to separate the questions, because we didn't want one direction to be a victim of the other direction. We wanted, it's really two separate questions, so that's why we've broken it up into two phases. Yes, sir.
George, just to go back to something that you said originally when you were explaining the map, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think you said is that really the intent of this phase one is to correct something that was done wrong or incorrect map data.
Based on limited data.
Right. So
They
we're,
didn't intentionally say, we're gonna put this on this wrong. We just didn't have any better data at the time.
so we're really just trying to clean it up to make it in accordance with the currently available data.
Yeah.
And it so happens that the way that we're trying to clean it up takes some areas out of resource protection and doesn't add any to resource protection for this proposed phase. We're not looking at adding anything to resource protection in this phase.
My experience in doing this for 40 years, if you got bad information you're basing your policy on, you better get that right before you do anything more.
So I have one more question, I think, based on what he just said. If phase one makes it right, what does phase two do?
Phase two applies the same criteria for land that is currently not restricted by resource protection, outside of the existing district.
If the phase one doesn't make everything right, it just brings.
Well, it makes at least what's right in terms of the data, but then there's other areas outside of that existing resource protection district that will meet the same criteria. We're saying, before you add more, fix what's broken in this area, to build some credibility. And then the question becomes, for those of you who have land in the existing district, should people outside the district that meet the same criteria not have to live by the same restrictions? And that's it's a very tough policy question, but you don't have to. The town could vote to say no. We've had it in this here for 20 years and that's enough.
So why wasn't the gray areas that you expressed are really kind of idiotic, why are they still in there if we're trying to clean up what's not correct?
Because you can't change this without going to the town meeting vote.
Well, we are going to town meeting vote, but why weren't those gray areas added to the pieces that were being pulled out if you feel that they are not?
Can I answer that? Because the
Yeah.
areas we're pulling out are areas that don't meet any of the criteria on the map for resource protection. The gray areas that you're referring to do have criteria that would call for them to be in resource protections. That's the distinction. The areas that we're proposing to pull out of resource protection don't have none of the resource protection criteria applies to those pieces of land. So that's what we're trying to fix. Any other questions or comments on resource protection ordinance? changes? If not, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, and then at the end, we'll get through all four, and if you think of something, and at the end, we'll kind of do a cleanup, and you've got follow-up, give another bite at the apple. So roads would be the next one, George.
Okay, so back when the new comprehensive plan was adopted, the first project was to overhaul the land use ordinance, which was a mess. It was copied and pasted, patched together, terrible font, you couldn't even read it. The planning board struggled at every meeting to understand what it was saying. So first project was to just do a massive overhaul of the land use ordinance to make it a readable, workable document. We put off touching any of the difficult policy issues like the one we're talking about in part one. And another one was the issue of roads, how the town regulates roads. And this part two, dealing with road policy, has three parts. The first part is backlot access. The comprehensive plan recognized that for someone to do a single backlot and have to build a 20-foot road to serve one house, 20-foot wide road, back 300 to 600 feet, that defeats the purpose of allowing backlots, which most towns do. Single lot, just a driveway. So that's one part of this. The second part of it is you talked about family development.
Yep.
Okay, so currently Durham, like most towns, allows, and state law allows it, to do what they call exempt lots. So if you're doing 3 lots, like say you own your property and you sell off 3 lots, that's gotta go to the planning board and be approved as a subdivision. But if you're giving one of those lots to a family member, then you're not a subdivision and you don't have to get planning board approval. You still have to meet the zoning requirements. Now, part of the difficulty is with your rural zoning, is you have to have 300 feet of road frontage for every lot that you create. You may have limited road frontage and a lot of access. So Durham, like most communities, allows what they call, and it doesn't call it this, but most towns call it what they call a private way, to distinguish that this is not a subdivision. And so basically, it's a common road owned by the lots, and they're not required to get a subdivision approval where you have to look at the wetlands and the wildlife and the hydrology and all of those expensive engineering issues. All you gotta do is get an engineered road design and build it to the standards, and then have a maintenance agreement, because family members eventually are gonna not be there, and so it's important to have a maintenance agreement that ensures that that road's gonna be maintained. And it's not just the people that use it, it's also the public safety vehicles, including the ladder truck that I saw here the other day, that may need to use it to get to the home to be able to fire it. So most towns have that. What was voted down last year was a proposal to eliminate those private ways completely and make everybody go through the subdivision review process if you're going to build a new road. That got voted down. So I approached the select board and said, right now, the provisions for those private roads for family developments, basically it's in 3 different places. The road commissioner and the code officer approve the road. The planning board approves the maintenance agreement. And there's confusion over who has authority and responsibility, and the standards are scattered in 3 different parts. So this proposal is intended to simplify the process, give clear requirements, and make sure that as long as it's done right, somebody has the right to do that and not have to go to subdivision. Okay? So basically, these amendments will create a private way section in the ordinance. It's already there. It's called roads, private roads. And then most towns that I've worked with, the planning board reviews those, just like that subdivision, but it's just the road. I presented that to the planning board back in February. And they said, look, if it's just a matter of reviewing engineering, and there's not gonna be a public process, we don't see the point of having the planning board do it, let's just have the road commissioner do it. So this gives clear guidance. The road commissioner will be the only officer or board of the town that would be involved in the approval of those roads, And that's basically the proposal for that part.
So now is it 3 houses, is it 2 houses and then the third you have to have it? Or is it 3 houses and then if you do a fourth, you have to have a specific width?
Well, if you're gonna build a road, anything other than a single backlot driveway, you gotta get a road approved as a private way, whether it's 2 lots, 3 lots, 5 lots. So this will kind of clarify and codify the specifics of how you do that, and it'll simplify it.
So if it's already a private way, then adding another house on that shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, and the main thing is making sure that they join the maintenance agreement.
Okay.
Yeah, now, there's a third part to this, okay, the third part, so backlot driveway rather than road, private way, road commissioner rather than road commissioner and planning board and code officer. And the third part of this is that the current subdivision road standards are based on that old growth management plan. And that, part of that growth management plan said, the town will not accept any roads outside of this Southwest Bend District area, road district. And anything out of that, it's gotta be a private road. So the road standards are really based on whether it's gonna be a public road or a private road. Well, the town has no street acceptance policy, and it's not really accepting any roads, so everything is a private road. So this, proposes that the, everything new that's built, excuse me, so I didn't make that clear. So this proposes to say, what most other towns do is they base it on how many homes are served by it and how much traffic is generated. So they have what they call a minor local, which I think is up to 9 lots, a local, which goes up to 26 lots, and anything over that is a sub-collector. Each one of them is basically, the minor local is 20 feet wide with 2-foot shoulders. And it can be gravel up to, currently under 4 lots, and I know, Todd, you had an issue with that, we could discuss. And for 4 or more lots, it's gotta be paved, whether it's a subdivision or a private way, according to these stress standards. Many towns allow that to be a complete gravel road, if you're not a subdivision, and you have 7 lots, 3 family members, and a homestead. So that's a policy discussion. So the third part of it is changing from public-private road distinction to, is it a minor local road, is it a local road, or is it a collector road? Sub-collector, excuse me. So that's basically the proposal. There's a lot of details there that I'm not gonna try to get into, but if you see detailed questions, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Yes, Jane had her hand up.
So, let me just clarify, I thought that the town was taking on roads as long as they were built to standard.
No.
Cause didn't, at one point, we weren't taking on any new roads, and then I thought it was voted on that they would take it as long as it was built up to standard, then it would take it on. Am I incorrect?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so. Huh? Yeah, I did, I thought that. So, a backlot, I thought was allowed to have 1 house. But you're talking if you have a private way, you put more than 1 house lot on that. And that, the difference is it's a narrower road.
Just a driveway for 1 house, it's a narrow road for 2 or more.
And it will never become a public way. The town will not be responsible for that.
Never say never. The town could adopt a policy that says, yeah, we're gonna take over the maintenance of all those private roads.
Well, we've been here long enough.
And make
that
them
we know
public
that
roads, that's a policy some towns do, not many do it these days.
Alright. When you were talking, about dividing and having 3 lots, is that only to family, or could that just be a person that has a big piece of land and then wants to?
There are several exemptions, but generally, if you're creating a new house lot, it's gotta be a family member. The house, if you've lived there at least 5 years, that's called the Homestead Exemption. So you could do that as a separate lot without getting a subdivision approval. So theoretically, you could carve off 2 acres with the existing house, gift a lot to 3 children, that's 4 new lots, quote unquote, and then sell off 2 to help generate the road to build it, and you still wouldn't be a subdivision under state law and under the local subdivision ordinance.
Okay, and then for people that are in a situation like that, where there are already 2 or 3 houses on the road that exists already, and then they're going to do more.
Yeah.
Does the first part of that road, if it doesn't meet the criteria, if they're extending, does the first part of the road have to meet it, or is it just from there forward?
That's a tough question, and everybody struggles with it. You know, you've had some subdivisions built, remember Todd, on Day Road? And it's a, you know, what do you do? The road right now doesn't meet standards, and it's a tough question, and there's no easy answer to it. But generally, if you're going to be expanding that road, but a 20-foot minor local road is gonna serve up to 9 lots, so that's gonna give you some accommodation.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about roads that already, I'm just thinking of my neighbors actually, and I know that their road isn't up to, well, not you, Dan, not your part, the other people. Your road's awesome. Okay, so that answers that question. The other one, I just have one other question, is that this is not going to take roads like Dan's Road, Milky Way Lane, right? And turn that into a road that the town is now responsible for plowing and maintenance. That is not gonna happen, even if the road is paved. Even if, like,
That's
a new
a
subdivision.
policy question for
Yeah,
town
no, the
meeting.
answer is no, there's nothing in the proposed road ordinance change that would lead to the town taking on responsibility for more roads. See, that would be a completely separate question, and George has prompted the select board a couple of times, like, you guys don't have a policy to accept any more roads. And we're like, yep. And, that's kind of the way the town wants it right now. At some point in the future, if there are enough private roads and enough taxpayers on those roads that, that feeling might shift in town, but right now, that's not where we are. So there's nothing in here that obligates the town or leads the town to take on responsibility for more roads.
So one, the road thing was irritating to me, just because back in 05, 06, I think it was, I asked the town for a building permit on Pound Road. It's a 17-acre lot, which my parents owned, and there's a foundation with a trailer on it, and I wanted to take that off and put a house. And I was told I couldn't unless I brought the whole dirt road up to town spec. And if anybody knows Pound Road, there's a cattle pound, which is there, so you can't do it. So I was removing one home to build another home, and I was told I couldn't do it at all. And now other people have built there, that's a different story, but. Besides that, so the backlots, when do you need 300 feet of road frontage for a backlot if it's a family member's? Because reading the backlots here, it says that you need a 50-foot right of way if you don't have the 300-foot frontage, and you can get a deeded.
So basically, if you had 400 feet of frontage,
Yeah.
you don't have enough for 2 lots, but you got enough for 1 lot plus a back lot. And the 50-foot access would be basically the street frontage, and you'd build a 16-foot driveway for that single back lot.
So realistically, you only need 350, is that
You need
correct?
at least 350, but you only need 350, correct?
50 for the road and 300 for the original. Yes, sir? Check, sir?
If it was defined as a right-of-way, from what I understand, you need 50 feet from that right-of-way, but if it's defined as an easement, you don't need the 50 feet? Is that right or wrong?
I don't know.
Cause I have a right-of-way in Freeport, and I couldn't build.
Some ordinances
It's called a
say-
right-of-way.
Yeah, some ordinances say you gotta be setback from the easement.
But if it's called an easement, I could cut right up against that right-of-way, or long driveway. But, and I had one more question, what's the smallest footprint you can build in Durham, the square footage of the dwelling? Do you have a minimum?
Of the lot or of the building?
The building. Do you have a minimum?
We're not talking about tiny homes tonight.
No, no, I don't, no, I'm not thinking that. But is there a minimum?
I don't.
There's like the Boca building code has minimum square footage for various things, so, but that's a different issue.
But Durham, no.
I don't do building either, no assessing, no building.
I'm looking at the, section 5.7 backlots, number 5 there. It looks like the driveway width was changed from, was it previously 20 feet?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the changes, is if you're doing that single backlot driveway, we changed it from a 20-foot requirement to a 16-foot requirement because it's a driveway.
And just to explain why that's 20 feet, just from what I understand, is basically the fire department has seen these things go in, and then all of a sudden there's 4 houses on it. And so they said, it really needs to be 20 feet wide because they're gonna do more development on it. So this specifically says it can only serve 1 lot. So, and this provides protection that before a building permit can be issued for the back lot that's served by that driveway, the fire chief has to sign off on it that he can get his trucks down it. And it has to be a turnaround at the end for them.
Yeah, this gentleman is next right here.
So, if you have an existing back lot, is it grandfathered? The road doesn't need to meet any of these new requirements if this passes? I'll be able to get a building permit on an existing back lot?
Existing back lot, you'd have to have a 20-foot road built to it.
There is a road.
Okay.
It's 50 feet, doesn't have an
Well,
association.
the right of way is 50 feet, I'm assuming.
The right of way is 50 feet.
Right, and how wide is the travel surface?
It's, I'm guessing maybe 30 feet?
30 feet?
I'm guessing maybe 30 feet?
Just understand, 20 feet is like, this is probably 16.
Yeah, so in this case, the requirement is getting less restrictive, so if you're okay now, you're gonna be okay later, because the current requirement is 20 feet for, if it's a single back lot, and it would become 16
Well, there's
feet.
2 other houses at service,
Oh,
I've
okay.
got the 3rd back lot.
So what's there now is grandfather.
Exactly, that's my question, so I'll be able to build regardless.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, the back's way
Thank
big.
you. I'm just confused, so you mentioned that, which kind of road can be 16 feet wide?
A single driveway for a single back lot.
Okay, and you also made reference to the fire department's aerial, the ladder truck. So for the ladder truck to be deployed, I believe it needs a little bit over 18 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So why would a fire chief sign off on the building lot knowing that, you know, the new home, we cannot access it with all of our equipment?
Generally, I don't think they put the ladder truck in the driveway leading to the home, they put it at the home, which is usually has clearance, so. And that again is why the fire chief has to sign off on it before they can get a building permit. They gotta show them how much area they're gonna clear around the house, make sure that they can get their vehicles and equipment close enough to the house. And so the fire chief is gonna have to sign off on it before they approve it. We had that discussion.
Why the change? Maybe you said, but I missed it.
Well, the point of having a backlot is so that people can give lots, develop lots without doing subdivisions. And if it's too expensive, what they end up doing is looking to sell that land to developers. So one goal of it is affordable housing, more affordable, if there is such a thing anymore. And secondly, part of retaining the rural character is trying to give incentives to not do subdivisions for some landowners. Does that make sense?
Not to me.
No? Okay.
How do you get a subdivision out of a backlot?
Well, they may have a lot of backland, they may have 20, 30 acres, and they just wanna do a single backlot for a relative, they don't wanna develop land. But they can't do that except over the 20-foot road. Currently.
Or they wait every 5 years for that.
That doesn't address the road issue.
Yeah, gentlemen. So on the topic of the turnaround for the backlot, the proposed language is a turnaround adequate to serve public safety vehicles shall be constructed at the end of the backlot driveway. Is there, I didn't see anywhere in here that defined adequate. Is there any consideration given to giving some general guidelines to what adequate would mean so that someone who's looking at doing it knows where to start at least?
You could do that, this plan says, let the fire chief decide if he can get his vehicles around, rather than prescribing, like a subdivision, has to have a big turnaround. If you can get by with less than that, then, so that's the downside. If you prescribe it, they have to build it.
So, we do have a prescription for a subdivision, what's required?
Yes.
Would we maybe wanna consider adding language that says, like, it's never gonna have to exceed this, which is for a subdivision, something that says, that you might, I don't know, somehow point to what's required for a
Shall not
subdivision.
exceed clause,
Shall not
something
exceed the
like that.
requirement for, something, I don't know, just the word adequate in that just kinda stood out to me as ambiguous.
It's hinged to the fire chief to put in.
No, I understand, right, you're,
take the
if
fire
you're putting it
chief-
on one person, that's,
Yeah, if
that's.
you pull the fire chief out of there, then you gotta probably run all the specifics. This gives more, flexibility, it gives more flexibility.
Just a comment.
Yep.
You have 300 feet of road frontage, and you build along the road, you only need 2 acres, the back lot has to be 5. Am I right? Okay.
Yep.
The lady in the white shirt?
So we just had a road approved to get to 2 lots in the back that we gave our children.
Yep.
And we have a hammerhead at the end of that road, but their driveways are coming off of that. So I still need the turnaround on that road as well as
Well, there is where the fire chief could look at that and say, if I get my vehicles around here, you don't have to build a separate background, you can use those driveways as cutoff turnarounds.
Okay, cause we haven't, the road's half done.
Yep.
That's another $20,000 to get that all put in at the end. So if I don't have to spend that money now, or I can put it into their driveways at the end, cause that's the objective here, is to give our family a place to live. So we're helping them out as best as we can, but I don't wanna put in 2 of those turnarounds if I don't have to. So just one, at the end of their driveway. Is that my understanding, if this goes
If the
through?
fire chief says I can get my vehicles turned around there, that's fine.
Like I said, I appreciate hearing that you're making this backlot kind of amendment there, for one driveway, that's nice to hear. I'd like to see Durham become a little more family friendly in that sense, like what my wife was saying. We've got 3 children, but we can't do 3 backlots. And I would encourage you to move in that direction, cause you have people in town here who have more than 1 child who might like to stay in this town. But there are other towns that are more friendly, you might say.
But I'm sorry, I wanna make sure I understand, are you asking like a smaller lot size requirement for backlot, is that what you're advocating?
No, that I don't have to put a 20-foot, that you don't have to put a 20-foot highway in if you have 3 children. See, couldn't they all be serviced? However you wanna do it, but just make it a little more encouraging to our families here. So rather than just 1 backlot, you could have 2 or 3, like in our case, we have plenty of room there. The size of the lot doesn't matter. But, it's discouraging, to realize you gotta drop $60,000 or $70,000 into a road that's 20 foot wide through, a lovely wooded pastured area, something that's very sylvan and serene. And you gotta put a highway in there. So, I just encourage you to, I'm glad to hear what you're thinking about, but I would encourage you to maybe go a little further than before I get my road done.
Any other questions or comments on the road? Yes, ma'am.
What is the lot size for, over in Aquifer? Is it still 5 acres, or has that changed?
I believe it's still. If it's using on-site septic, which everybody is, it's 3 acres in the aquifer
Is it 3
protection.
acres now?
Always been. In the natural code?
Yeah.
It's always been.
Always been 3 acres, not 5?
3 acres.
When we bought the property in 1976, it was 5 acres minimum for a lot.
But that was a backlot? No, aquifer protection? Yeah, now, there is a requirement that the bigger the home, sometimes you have to, and they do an analysis of the groundwater. So you might have to have it bigger than 3 acres, but 3 acres is the minimum in the aquifer protection district.
How much of Durham is an aquifer? Can you show with a swipe of your hand?
Okay, so this area right in here, I think we're sitting right in it, this is all aquifer, mapped sand and gravel aquifers. This area here, and this area here, those are the only 3 areas that are aquifer protection. And basically, that could be a public water supply at some point. And so the idea is to protect that groundwater resource.
Todd?
Yes.
Sorry, man, I didn't put that looking right over there.
The way this is written right now, construction of a private way must be, eventually would have to be paved. I, would like to propose an amendment to 5.23E. It says, construction of private ways shall meet the construction standards for minor local roads found in Appendix 1, which is a paved road. And add on, except for paving at that point, and erosion and sediment control standards of Appendix 2. That way, your road, for instance, wouldn't have to be paved. You could keep it as a gravel road, you would take care of it, you have a maintenance agreement, you maintain your own gravel road. That's the plan. Exactly, but with this, that's not the plan. You would have to pave it.
And Todd and I did discuss that, and I offered that language to address that issue. Generally, if you're in a subdivision, you have to pave after the 3rd lot, the whole thing. And for private way, he's proposing to add language. And I'll look to the select board for direction on that.
Scott, you know my road is good to go. Very nice.
So that, I was under the impression that you already put that language in.
Again, as we discussed, the purpose of the public hearing is to take public input.
Yeah.
And if the select board reviews the discussion here tonight, including some of the ideas that have been offered going farther, you could theoretically have that posted, the new draft, date it, and that could be considered. Remember you said you agreed with that?
Yeah. But I thought you had already done that.
No, this is the public hearing, so I think we do it before, I offered him that language.
Okay,
to
got it.
discuss tonight.
So, I think that would be, the board would discuss that, our next meeting is Tuesday night. Todd will be there, right?
Yeah.
So, it's your birthday. We'll bake you a cake and get you a gravel road for your birthday, how's that? So, I think if I understand it, the suggestion is for a private way, that it would never have to be paved no matter how many lots are on it, or what's the threshold? Oh, I'm asking you.
It's a private way.
Why is it even paved?
Well, the thing about private ways is that, and this is a common thing you hear about, and I don't have any skin in this game, so it doesn't really matter to me, honestly, but what you hear over and over again from planners in other communities is that what starts as a backlot, and then it becomes 3-family lots. And then a generation later, it's not the family that owns that land anymore, it's somebody else, and then there are more lots, and all of a sudden you have what really should be a subdivision and gone through the subdivision process to make sure the road was adequate and everything of that sort is a bad situation. So I think a lot of these things are intended to kind of, prevent that type of situation over the long term. So that's why it tends to be that, okay, well, once you get to this point, then we need to upgrade the road. And so I think the language in there now is after the
3
third.
lots, more than 3, you gotta pay this.
Right.
Which is what's in the subdivision regulations.
Right. So.
But if there's a maintenance agreement on it.
Well, I think we can, discuss that at the board meeting on Tuesday, and the board will discuss and vote whether to make that change in the language or not. And then if there's a change, it'll get reposted. Everything has to be posted, at least 7 days before town meeting, so basically we have until the 26th to post like the final version of, warrants, or ordinance changes or whatever, so that would give us time to do that, so we can have that discussion at the board meeting on Tuesday.
George, do you have an opinion on that?
Sure we do.
Unscientific poll, just as a point of information, to take back to the board. So if those that would be in favor of Todd's suggestion that if it's a private way, that there essentially would be no requirement to ever pave that road. Am I here? Is that what you're saying?
Can I ask a question before we take a vote? Is a subdivision considered a private way?
No, subdivision is a subdivision. And
That goes through the
this
planning
is-
board process.
This is a whole different animal.
Okay, I just wanna make sure that those are two separate things. This would not apply to a subdivision.
Right, that's right.
Kevin, I have one thing.
Yes.
So I dealt with this in Freeport. They had a private way and they ended up putting a subdivision off the private way. And I get what you're saying, it is a nightmare.
Yeah.
Because then they hire somebody like me to come grade the road, well, this person pays this much and there's no set boundary, so what you're saying, I totally get.
Yeah, it's,
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to think about it as families, but it doesn't have to be families. Like, I have 10 acres, I could split off a lot now, a lot in 5 years, and eventually I have 5 lots in there that the planning board's never looked at. It can be ugly as hell, the road can be vastly undersized, so the fire department can't get down to the last 2 houses. And that's why it's important to think long-term instead of, oh, my kids are moving in here. Your kids aren't gonna live there in 50, maybe they will. But chances are, it's not gonna be your kids living there in 50 years. So thinking long-term, we're gonna have to live with them.
No, but they need a place to live now, and it's family land, and you've spent your whole life savings on it, so it's a good spot for them now.
that's the balance.
Sure.
We have a lot of dirt roads here, Lauren. I mean, why do we not have more dirt roads?
I just bought a new gravel bike, I love dirt roads.
I don't know why, I mean, why not have more
Can you,
gravel roads?
I live on Snow Road, and if the fire department tried
Hold on,
to
Ian,
get
stop
at
talking,
it
don't come
before
back.
it was graded, they wouldn't have been able to. So, right?
Town used to have a lot of dirt roads, but the fire department got around.
So and again, it's not scientific, it's just a data point, I just wanna see if there's kinda like overwhelming consensus one way or the other. Like, if you would be in favor of basically, changing the language so that a private way would not have to be paved regardless of how many lots are on it. If you would be in favor of language like that, can you raise your hand?
But I think it said more than 3. and it's
That's what it
3.
says now.
Right, okay. So you would leave it to say that.
2/3 of the room, I guess, is that a fair estimate? Okay, alright. So we will, and there is there's always a public comment period at the select board meeting, so if you wanna come and express your opinion on this, we'll put on the board will be discussing it, then you're certainly welcome to come and provide that. Alright, yes, sir.
I've been having conversations actually with a construction guy about building a road, and what he's spoken about quite a bit is a 14-foot road, which he led me to believe that was sort of standard. Is 16-foot standard?
I'm gonna defer to George on that, I don't know.
Well, my son-in-law and my daughter live on a private way in Falmouth that's about 14 feet wide. And basically, when he's driving his truck, and I'm driving in with my little car, one of us has to get off the road to be able to pass. So that's kind of the issue. Typically, a travel lane on a road is 10 feet wide, minimum, to give you some clearance. So 16 feet, I think, for a driveway, and again, part of the issue is getting a large fire apparatus down that driveway. 16 feet is kind of the standard. Could be less, could be more. Fire departments would say make it 18 feet.
Are you done? You good?
I have some questions about parking, and I know that that's part of this part, so I just didn't wanna move out of roads, cause they did have
Okay.
questions about parking, but we can wait till we're done with the roads part to get to those.
Anything else on the roads before we'll move to parking? Yep.
Sorry, I have a pile of comments.
A what? I'm
So
sorry?
I have a whole pile of administrative comments on the proposed language. But the functional, I think my functional comment here is, there's a proposed change from 10% grade within the right-of-way for a driveway to 3% grade within the right-of-way for a driveway. Which is, 3% is only 1.7 degrees, which is almost completely flat. So I was just, there wasn't really any justification in here, as to why that was being done, if maybe it's a standard, you know, I don't know.
It is a standard, because if you think about it, if you live on a hill and you're coming down to the road, and you go 10% all the way to the shoulder of that road, you know, slippery day, you could be out in the road. Similarly, if you're on the downslide of the road and you're trying to get up on the road,
Yeah.
and it's 10% right to the road right away, that's a very difficult thing to get onto. So typically, most towns have within the right of way of the road, maximum 3% grade. From there, so basically you create one landing for one vehicle.
So 3% is this kind of most counts.
Isn't that the state, that's the state spec,
If you
right?
were getting an MDOT permit, yeah.
Okay. And sorry, I have a bunch of administrative comments and questions on the proposed language. 5.2, the first sentence in 5.2, I don't think that you need, on the last sentence there, I don't think that you need, if they are addressed during the planning board review, I think it may be covered already in the sentence. I think that's redundant earlier in the sentence.
Well, yes and no. The reason it's in there is to clarify that that's something that the planning board has to look at, and if they do, and they basically review that, typically with input from the road commissioner or peer review engineer, then they don't have to get a separate permit from the public works director. So it's in there to say that it has to be discussed at the planning board meeting to be exempt from the road commissioner permit requirement. That's the intent.
But it's, right, but it says that, I think it says that already in the beginning of the sentence, where it says, except that driveways and commercial entrances approved by the planning board during subdivision or site plan review shall not be required to have a separate review for compliance with these standards. I think that's covered in that first part, but anyway, that's just something to consider in the language. That's a comment.